Sorry. Thank you. And so my paper is titled Doing It for the Gram, Constructing the Self on Finstagram Accounts. I'll begin by looking at what exactly a Finsta is in terms of, how we colloquially come to describe it, what my research question was, notions of the self that sort of emerge when we are using a computer-mediated platform of communication, the research methodology I employed, the framework that I was working with, the consequent findings and analysis, the general argument that I had, and then the key texts and possibilities for future research. So what exactly is a Finsta, right? Instagram has become one of the most widely used platforms across the world, and there is an idea that you have a primary account, which is your real Instagram or your Rinstagram, but there is another account that a lot of people have, which is a secondary account, and that becomes a Finstagram. So Jay Owens, in his essay called Post-Authenticity and the Ironic Truths of Meme Culture, he talks about Finstagram as a space or a profile for trash pics and the outtakes or the reel from your main hyper-curated Instagram account. So it's basically a separated and demarcated space where you could effectively post things that you wouldn't normally post on your main Instagram account. And these are other words that people use to describe, the real Instagram as opposed to the Finstagram. So people would use words like alternative account or secondary account, or my OG Instagram, my original Instagram, or my primary account, my main account. So there seems to be a distinction between the user's main Instagram account as opposed to their secondary or fake, so to say, Instagram account. And now I'll present a couple of screenshots from my respondents' profiles who agreed to share with me the bios and stuff like that. So if you look at it, you will be able to notice that there is not only a of course, you can look at the sort of the bio. It has a different take, and you can also look at the sort of the audience, or even just in terms of quantity. Your main account or the real Instagram is open to a larger public, so to say, whereas the Finstagram is not as open. And if you look at the screenshot here, the person's bio says the book about my life will be called Safarnama, and this is a preview. And I think this is a pun on Safarnama, which was a classic Persian text from the 11th century talking about travels, but here it's about suffering. So people will often joke about, and this is what it looks like. So I think visually your real Instagram for this person, as opposed to the fake Instagram. Similarly, we have another person who was my respondent, and she also talks about how her Finsta is, a meme page where she makes fun of herself, as opposed to her more quote unquote socially appropriate account, which is her real Instagram. So these examples, and if you look at the content, you'll see one seems to be more visually aesthetically pleasing. There seems to be some effort that was put into curating it into looking beautiful, whether it's filters or edits or things like that, as opposed to the one on the left, which seems to it'll include funny screenshots from a conversation or a night where you were too inebriated, things like that. Likewise, so you would notice things and patterns that emerge from people's Finstagram versus their Instagram. One interesting respondent mentioned to me how their Finsta was in fact not themselves. So it was like a distinction from who they are, and a sort of a negation or opposition to them. So I think this is interesting because it points towards a dichotomy between the self and the other, where both the self and the other are not necessarily two distinct individuals or two distinct persons. So the questions that sort of drove this were to look at, like the previous presenter also mentioned, how these platforms become a site for constructing the self in everyday life, how people participate and perform in it, and what is the nature of interactions, not just with other people, but also what sort of implications or consequences does this have for visualizing the self. Now I have like sort of broadly categorized the self, or through literature, as self as a brand. So there is an idea of marketing the self as a commodity, like you would like as Adorno would talk about in his culture industry, the self as an author. So a lot of work on media studies and autobiographical studies talk about how people are just invested in talking about stories, and stories are narratives. And so in this sense, how does the self become an author? Then the question about authenticity, right? If there is a fake Instagram, then how real or how unreal is that, as opposed to the quote unquote real Instagram? And finally, the self as reflexive, which is to sort of go against the idea of the logical self, or the post-enlightenment idea of the rational self rather, but more of a self that is reflexive, a self that is subjective and conversation or in tandem with their surroundings. I did a pilot through my own Instagram story, and carried out a poll. Then I carried out another poll in May 2020, where my cohort of respondents and also audience was largely urban, English speaking, upper middle class Indian youth. And they were usually mostly in their early 20s, so to say. So then I did an online survey where I requested them to fill a Google form. And after that, there was a secondary poll where I did one-on-one interviews with people who did have, Finstagram accounts. And now, the conceptual framework that sort of I was dealing with is to look at the sociology of knowledge. So using Berger and Luckman's, idea that reality is socially constructed, I wanted to explore how this becomes a site of producing and consuming knowledge. How then it becomes, the process of online world making processes and shifts in genres, so to say, can be brought into the picture simultaneously, because you're not just self-making, you are Bloomer's symbolic interactionism will let us know that we don't really work in isolation. And I'd like to believe that the similar processes do take place on the online or virtual worlds as well. And finally, to look at the rules and norms that govern everyday life. I mean, it's not a surprise that these norms exist in offline lives, but I do tend to think that there are these similarities that exist in the offline, space as well. So the things that sort of stood out most were that, of course, there is more control over what you can put out, or the information about yourself you can share, because you can consciously edit, filter, delete, archive, time, whatever you're sharing, whether it's your real Insta or your fake Instagram. And there seems to be an explicit demarcation, or what I like to call a self-imposed public and private, between the Finsta and the real Insta in terms of content, nature, tone, audience, things like that. And in the interview and the questionnaire, people did sort of talk about how there seem to be unsaid rules on Instagram about how people, it's not okay for me to post 3 times a day. So if I do feel like posting 3 times a day, I will go to my Finstagram, where these norms seem to be less strict. So like I said previously, so even though the presentations of the self is explicitly and more visibly curated on the real Instagram, um, users tend to leave behind, involuntary impressions, cues, and ideas that contribute to their image on both the platforms. And because of the fact that there is a conscious demarcation between the audience, the Finsta then becomes a space for a safe space, so to say, which is more liberating, which is carefree. One doesn't really need to put in that much thought, because a lot of my respondents mentioned how they use other apps to plan out what they post on their main Instagram account. So they would like to see the layout. I would like to see how it looks like before I actually put it out there. But for the Finstagram, this does not necessarily seem to be the case. And finally, because these rules can be sort of circumvented, people can negotiate the way that they practice or behave or perform a certain idea of what they think is best representing themselves through language, through imagery, so on and so forth. So here's my take on, this is that there is definitely a paradox between how we quickly assume the real is going to be real and the fake is going to be false or pseudo. In fact, my respondents seem to be more raw, more unfiltered, quite literally, on their, Finstagram accounts. However, at the same time, this is not to say that the real Instagram is fake or pseudo. I think this just goes on to say that there is a multiple or like a plethora of selves that one decides to actively, voluntarily or involuntarily ends up, putting on Instagram or even other, platforms, social media platforms. And I think the Finstagram thus marks a turning point or a change in the manner in which the narrator would recount the protagonist's story. And this is borrowed from Jeremy Bhaane. I think there's a typo there. Sorry about that. But you know how, like in literature, people would talk about how narratives are composed of describing, intentional states, desires, beliefs, and even deciding what is worth telling. Why is this element of my story worth telling, and to whom am I sharing this? So I think this turning point becomes crucial because it's not just about telling a story to different audiences that I've handpicked, but I think it is an important marker for the user themselves, because it actually gives the user, for example, some of my respondents would say that they've been told that you're exactly like you seem like your Instagram profile, or you're not so much as you seem as your Instagram. So things like that, where the turning point is basically not just about your relationship with someone else, but also your relationship with yourself, how you view yourself. And this is not to say one is that there needs to be a hierarchy between the two, but that they could both be valid and mutually coexist, and I guess reinforce both ideas or notions of the self. And ultimately, I would just, this would reaffirm that reality does seem to be socially constructed, like Berger and Lupin have pointed out. These are a couple of the texts that I did refer to in my presentation. And I'm so sorry, I've gone slightly over time limit, but I'll quickly just go over, possible questions that could come out of things like this, especially because it's so interdisciplinary: sociology, literature, media studies, and there's so much scope for doing like an ethnography, figuring out online rituals, things like that. So these are just some questions that I've just thrown out, for speculating, and that would be it. Thank you so much, and I'm super sorry for rambling and taking up like a little extra time.